This is the final talk of today. It's about preventing forest fires in Active Directory. Your presenter is Alex Martirosya. He's a senior penetration tester at Wolf's IT Assurance Services Group, where he's responsible for coordinating and conducting penetration testing services for clients in a variety of industries, including financial, healthcare, and software. His expertise consists of internal and external network penetration testing, threat emulation exercises, social engineering, vulnerability assessments, cloud security assessments, and Active Directory security reviews. He also has experience working with standards from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the Center for Internet and Security, leveraging the MITRE adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge framework. Alex has over 5 years of experience performing security assessments and holds certifications from industry-recognized organizations such as Offensive Security and Global Information Assurance Certification. Here's Alex.
Awesome. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I realize I'm one of the last sessions before happy hour, so I'll try to be brief and as efficient as possible. I appreciate you folks attending and remaining attentive for the session. So before I just jump in, just wanted to give some motivations behind this talk and what we'll be going through. I've had this talk idea for quite some time at this point, and I was trying to recognize if there was actually a need for this type of talk, because what we'll be going through is nothing novel or new. It's something that we commonly see. The techniques I'm going to be talking about against Active Directory really has been well researched for the past 20 years or so. And part of the motivations is, as a penetration tester, I see some familiar faces, so please stop by the booth, by the way. We're Wolf & Company. I'm part of the DenSecure group. We have a booth out there, so if you're still new or want to chat a little bit later, please stop by. But part of the motivation is, as a penetration tester, as I've talked to some of you, we commonly perform a penetration test, when maybe it's an internal assessment against Active Directory. We scope the engagement, we identify findings, we make recommendations, we deliver the draft report. We're really happy we got domain admin as a pen tester, and we think we're done. Next year, as we come back, if we're lucky enough to do the work again, or if the client is doing a penetration test with a different provider, what ultimately ends up happening is that they see the same results. Nothing was changed or nothing was remediated. So what I wanted to do with the session is go over at least the priorities, the top techniques that I've performed and seen our team internally perform, and also go through some practical recommendations, almost like a cheat sheet, because it's all too far common that I see these techniques, and either a penetration tester is not familiar with Active Directory to perform them against your own networks, or it's just due to time and resources and their constrained and capabilities that they're unable to perform them or remediate them. So I wanted this to be kind of like the cookie cutter or the playbook that you can kind of look back on. And all the slides will be posted, so we're going to move kind of quickly just to make sure we have and cover as much content as possible. My Twitter, I'll refuse to use X or call it X. My Twitter handle is up there. That's where I'll be posting the slides via GitHub. So there's going to be some animations and slides and live demos. So if it's a little bit too difficult for you to read or you're unable to take pictures on your phone, don't worry too much. They'll be accessible just so you can review. So a little bit about who am I? I started really as an IT auditor, and that introduced me to reviewing and understanding what Active Directory actually is. I mentioned it earlier, but as a pen tester, you don't really get familiarity with Active Directory until you're actually targeting enterprise networks. If you're a graduate student or a student itself, I highly recommend to dive into Active Directory. It's not going anywhere anytime soon, and it needs people to start performing assessments continuously. We can't do what we've been doing in offensive security, and I'll get into that in just a minute. I studied mathematics in college, so I like to motivate problems and talk about really rigorous approaches to how do we solve those types of big questions and problems. It was computational math, so I really like graph theory. If people are familiar with Bloodhound, we'll get into what that tool does, but that's I guess a hint before we dive into the techniques. Yeah, I've been in cybersecurity for a little over 5 years now, specialized mainly in AD assessments. We'll get into what that actually means. And again, the slides will be posted on GitHub. So the agenda, first we'll start what Active Directory is, at least from the lens of a penetration tester. I'm not going to go into the specifics and technical details. Just so you know, it's been around for 20 years. It's really the backbone of most organizations. If you're lucky enough to not use Active Directory, and I don't mean that as a statement against Microsoft, but if you're lucky enough to not have it and you are simply using Intune or whatever the latest replacement is, great for you, but you can still probably take away some of the techniques, since we'll talk about the cloud as well in just a bit. We'll also look at the history of the research that's gone under against Active Directory. It's a very well-researched technology since it's been around for so long, and also look at the perspective as a pen tester to see how our testing has evolved over the years as well. Common techniques, like I mentioned, we're going to try and hit 10 as fast as possible, and we'll also look at how the hybrid identity technology, Microsoft 365, affects Active Directory as well. So we look at some of the external attacks as well. I'll also try to mention some recommendations, but if you have specific questions, feel free to reach out by Twitter, come by the booth, we could chat. So Active Directory overview, it's been around since the 90s, but really since the early 2000s. The earliest domain that I probably saw was 2003. But just something to know and how you should think about the directory structure and to motivate the problem is if you start a company and you need to ensure that employees can access one server, instead of provisioning 10 different unique accounts per user, you can provision the access based on their own identity. So what Active Directory really excels in is storing information, and that information can be enumerated or identified by an attacker. So that's essentially the penetration tester's lens from it. It's a source of truth and a place that we can examine objects and data, and we're going to use that data to further our attack and identify and explore interesting things. It's really, like I mentioned, the backbone of identity management as well. So if we compromise the domain or we compromise a user that's tied to the domain, we could start exploring what that user actually has access to, because Active Directory gets hooked into workstations, servers, really storing any object that you tie into it. And that makes sense from an operations perspective. You want to tie as much technology as you possibly can, so that way you're not wasting resources and ensuring you're not adding too much complexity in your own environments. So the one key point too to note in terms of why Active Directory is so well researched and sought after by not only threat actors but also penetration testers is because of the backwards compatibility that Microsoft has extended for the operating system. We'll get into the specifics of that, but just note that's one of the key features that Microsoft has supported and enabled some of these attacks to persist by default. Penetration testers, our tactics, techniques, and procedures have not changed all that much. They have modified with new research, but we're going to go over some attacks that have persisted for quite some time, and I hope, at least from a takeaway, that you can remediate them or talk about them internally, and maybe even test them yourselves before a pen tester like myself comes in. So again, from an operations perspective, Active Directory really excels at providing scale for the enterprise. You're able to hook in workstations, manage them at a scale that probably wasn't imaginable when it wasn't even technology, or the directory services wasn't a capability for institutions. We'd be able to now hook into the cloud. We have so many ways that we can kind of integrate different technologies and leverage what Active Directory provides of storing that information and use it within our own enterprises. You can be as creative as you want within group policy. So group policy is how you actually implement security configurations, or really anything that you want. So if you want to change everyone's desktop background for your HR department, you can. If you want to change how the screen timeout or inactivity timeout for your employees works for a specific group of users, you can. The password policy, really anything that you want from an operating system perspective, you can, again, at scale, eliminate or modify configurations with group policy. But the important thing is that security is kind of placed on you, right? So what Microsoft has done is created this directory structure, and it's great in terms of from an IT and operations perspective, but the security really is on you, and that's really a misthought, especially over the past couple of years with institutions. They're starting to realize that they can't wear both hats of IT and security. Right, so managing Active Directory is almost a full-time job in itself, and we'll get into why and the common mistakes that I've seen over the years. This also means that the scheme and the layout of Active Directory is dependent on you. So there's a ranging scale of maturity that you can have. So for Active Directory, we're really talking about the domain structure. So if you work at a company, I work for Wolf & Co., so our domain is wolfandco.com. That's our root domain. But you can have several domains. You can have domains that are trusted by each other. You can have subdomains. So if I have Wolf & Co., maybe I have dev.wolfandco to support my development team, or really whatever endeavor I want to go through with my enterprise. In the end, and this is kind of a spoiler alert, the techniques are still going to be consistent. So they don't necessarily change based on how you lay out your domain. You may or may not be just adding more complexity. One of the interesting components that I've discovered over the years is the companies that have the less kind of complexity in their technology and scale of employees, maybe it's like 20 or 30 employees in total, that's usually the ones that have the most quote-unquote secure Active Directory. And the reason being is because they aren't using a lot of the services or technologies within Active Directory, and they simply have just deployed it in kind of this very simple manner. And that simplicity is what hopefully you can extend, because the more complexity you add, the attackers are probably going to have an easier time in your environments. The other part is the management of AD is still done in this kind of archaic way. Obviously, you can use PowerShell if you're a sysadmin, you're probably more familiar. But one of my favorite quotes from Microsoft, a security researcher at Microsoft, is, as long as attackers think in lists and attackers think in graphs, the attackers will always have an edge. So we'll get into what that actually means, but keep that in mind of thinking that attackers always like figuring out what the shortest path is. And we'll get into what that means, but this is essentially how you have to manage Active Directory. We have, at the very top, the root domain, so that's what I was mentioning. This is what it usually looks like. You have contoso.com, that's Active Directory's default template name. And then on the bottom, you have any other domains that are underneath that forest. The forest can be thought of as a root, because you can have multiple different forests. For simplicity, for this session, we're just going to talk about the one forest, one root domain, but I'll extend to kind of what it means near the end. And then you have different group policies that can implement security settings or those different configurations at the enterprise level as well. So that's what it looks like for an admin to essentially deploy something. So if it wanted to, for example, create a new password policy, they'd go to the default domain policy, create a new setting, and push it out through all their objects that are listed out. The easiest way that I think about Active Directory is almost like a folder structure to some extent. You're putting different objects of whether it could be a user as an object, a computer as an object, and applying different security settings with those group policies. Different files that do that. So this is my hot take for this session as well. You often hear that doom and gloom statement for especially members in the offensive security space say that Active Directory needs to be abandoned. We need to just burn it down to the ground and just make a new technology that replaces it entirely. I actually don't agree. I think Active Directory can be solved because it's not necessarily a hard problem. Now, again, that may be controversial for some of you to hear that it's not hard. But what I mean by hard is that Active Directory, most of the issues, at least the techniques that we'll be going through, have been already solved. There's already recommendations, there's remediation steps that you can go through. Now that may take resources and is a complicated endeavor for you to implement said recommendation. But as a problem statement, if we think about it, and this is kind of where my mathematics idea and brain goes into, but if we think about it, it's already been solved. This is not a hard problem. We're not trying to solve the shortest path problem for Google Maps or kind of cure the world of all these different illnesses. We're not doing that. They've already been solved technically. It's just a matter of maybe a lack of understanding or resources and capabilities. And hopefully that's going to be at least a driver for some of you to be able to implement internally. So before we get into the tactics and techniques, I do want to mention, at least from the offensive perspective, how penetration testing has changed. So over the years, penetration testing, and maybe it means a lot of different things to many different people, at least an internal network penetration test. The standard process has been to perform a vulnerability scan using something like Nessus, Nexpose, whatever the case is. And I don't mean to, those are great technology and tools. It's a very important piece of your vulnerability management program. But you perform a scan, you look at what's exploitable, and you run exploit. You run the latest a POC, which is proof of concept, and you run that exploit code to get a shell or compromise the system or get access to data. That's great and all, but a lot of the techniques that we're going to go through is not going to be identified by your vulnerability scanner. Unless you're kind of paying for a new service that's doing attack path management is really what it's called. Most of these issues I'm going to be talking about are going to be listed as informational, or they're not even going to be appearing in your vulnerability scan results. And if your penetration testing provider is only simply performing that scan and handing it back to you, which should be pretty easy to identify, if you're getting back TLS 1.0 findings in your internal network penetration test, please choose a different provider. Really at this point, a lot of the penetration testing has evolved to become these Active Directory-based assessments. And that could be done in two different ways. The first is from a device that's provided by your third party or internal team that's maybe running a virtual machine or Raspberry Pi, but it's running Kali Linux. It's not authorized by your security team in the sense they're not managing that device, but it allows you to efficiently and quickly identify issues. And that's where I think about penetration testing really as attack path or a QA assessment. We're trying to find as many unique attack paths as quickly and efficiently as possible. So when you're using Kali Linux as that virtual machine, you lose accuracy and realism because an attacker is not deploying or shipping off a device to you or deploying a virtual machine in your environment. But you gain speed, and that's why, at least for this session, a lot of the attacks and techniques I'm going to go through are demonstrated within Kali Linux, but I'll try to make a mention of which ones are at least more realistic and when an attacker can perform via a C2, a command and control infrastructure, because that's most likely how they're going to get in. That distinction is at least important to recognize, and we can chat about it after if you have questions. So let's go through the cookie cutter pen test. So you can see the cookie monster, he's exploring the forest, and if he's alone with that fire, bad things can happen. So this one surprised me. This is a recent report from a joint collaboration between CISA and the NSA, but they highlighted the top misconfigurations against, at least that they see in their assessments. And one of them was, and maybe is familiar for most of you, but it pointed out, first of all, the insecure name resolution protocols, LMNR and NetBIOS, but it also pointed out SMB signing. The reason it surprised me is because of what we just talked about. Now, I don't know if CISA or NSA knows more than I do, but the technique that we're going to go through, this man-in-the-middle technique, it's pretty difficult to pull off from an attacker perspective and very noisy if you do it via command and control. So most of the times, this technique is really relevant for a penetration tester. And if this is the first time you're hearing it, again, if you've ever done a pen tester, this is the first thing that they're going to do. And I'll explain what it means. But there's a link there down below into the actual report details. I was just more surprised if they knew something more or had actual intelligence to support kind of where they're seeing this sort of activity outside their own assessments. So I was kind of interested to understand how are they actually scoping this or what they're going through in their own methodology. So what does this actually mean? So insecure name resolution protocols, let's get into it. So everyone should be hopefully a little bit familiar with DNS, but it's essentially the translation that your computer will do to say, what does google.com actually mean to a computer? How do we actually access that site? Now Microsoft has, by default, created fallback protocols in the event that if DNS fails, if my computer can no longer reach google.com or my internal resources in my internal network of my actual Active Directory domain, if I can't reach wolfandco.com in the sense of the internal perspective of if I have some sort of host or DC, then these legacy protocols by default are going to start operating in the background. And since they're default, you have the ability to at least disable them, but you have to manage and do that within Active Directory itself, and most of the time they aren't. If you notice a report, they only mention LMNR and NetBIOS, but you should also be familiar with MDNS. All three of them have different remediation steps. So you can't just simply disable one and forget about it. It's all too common that we come into an environment. This is the first thing that we're running. We're using a tool called Responder. There's a couple others out there, but Responder is probably the most popular, at least for Kali Linux. And I'll show you what it looks like, but just understand that essentially what's being done in the background is the attacker has deployed their virtual machine, or they have compromised an endpoint. In this case, I'm going to make it simple and just talk about that we have Kali Linux sitting in the middle of the network. For many of our assessments, we go through that assume breach methodology where we have access to some user active subnet, kind of a sample representative of your own network conditions that you provide to any of your employees. And we're sitting in the middle of the network, we're running this tool called Responder, and those legacy fallback protocols are happening and occurring much more often than you probably imagine, and we'll go through an example, but they don't have security kind of at all. And what I mean by that, there's no authentication, there's no response that is kind of added to those legacy or insecure name resolution protocols, those three pointed out right here. And that means that I can be the one that kind of provides the answer first to the computer or the user that's looking for that resource. So if they're looking at, if they go to Edge or Chrome, or if they're on File Explorer, just looking for that network share, they may be typing something in, and those legacy protocols are going to simply just kick in. And again, this is typically labeled as an informational for your vulnerability scanners. So something just to note, this is going to be the first thing, and why I call it the cookie cutter pen test. This is most likely going to be the first way attackers are going to, or pen testers are going to get in. So what does it actually look like on the user side? Like I mentioned, they may be going to a network share, they're typing something in like houston.local, and even if you're typing in just briefly on the search bar within File Explorer, or going through Edge or Chrome or anything like that, those legacy protocols are kind of working in the background. And you may not even know that they're actually working or what they actually look like, but they're trying to resolve and figure out and explain to the computer, what is HughSec.local? Do I know what that is? Does anyone know what that is in the network? and the broadcast range of where that internal subnet is. Does anyone know what this is? And the attacker is sitting in the middle. They'll respond first and say, yep, that's me. What does it look like? This may be a little bit difficult to read, but you can see in green, once I run the command, it's going to start flashing the poisoned responses. And you can see LNR, NetBIOS, MDNS start popping up. And the most important thing to take away is the code that's highlighted in orange. In orange is the NTLMv2. That's a hash or authentication hashing protocol within Active Directory to ensure you can authenticate. Because if you need to access the F drive or if you need to access a resource internally, you need to authenticate to it with an Active Directory. And that happens for single sign-on reasons. You don't want to sign in every time you need to access something internally. It just happens magically. So this is how Microsoft has developed this technology or this protocol over the 20 years. It's kind of funny, they just released a blog post that they're hoping to completely disable NTLM in the coming years. But this is a huge security flaw because this hash, I could either take it offline and try to recover the plain text password, meaning I could just copy this entire string or this text in orange, and within that is your password. And that hashing protocol isn't the greatest. It's not something that your web app or Google is using to store your password. It's just something I can take and try to recover the plain text password. So here's a fix. I'm going to go really quickly, but there's a way to fix LMNR, at least via group policy. It's listed here. Again, slides will be provided if you need it. NetBIOS, disabled at the adapter level. Here's a PowerShell commandlet to do it. Now, you should probably do this via GPO, so if you do this via PowerShell commandlet, just know you should need to push this out via all your workstations and servers. MDNS, it's labeled here. There's a really good blog post that goes into how to actually disable it, but this is the process. Again, it's not a group policy. You're doing it via a specific registry edit, and you'd have to push that out via group policy again. But there's more. So within Active Directory in the Windows operating system, there's another default configuration, IPv6. Now, many of you may be asking, why am I talking about IPv6? I don't use IPv6 internally. Well, that doesn't matter, because your Windows operating system is configured to still support IPv6, and Microsoft says themselves not to disable it, right? They say in their documentation, if you look it up, they say not to disable it because it will mess with things in the cloud. That's great, but again, it's a similar attack where the attacker is in the internal network somehow. We have this Kali Linux VM, or we have this Raspberry Pi device sitting in the middle of the network, this broadcast range. We can affect the endpoints that we can communicate to, and we're essentially, instead of responding to those DNS requests or those legacy requests that are using those protocols, in this case, we're essentially handing out IP addresses to endpoints in your network, almost like a DHCPv6 server. That's essentially what's going on. And we're assigning these IPv6 addresses, and the Windows operating system by default is set to prefer IPv6 over IPv4. So what that means is now I can influence those connections that your endpoints are taking on, in the sense that I can specify what domain I want to poison or hijack those requests on. So each request, I can pretty much just say everything. I want to hijack everything. And all those connections are going to come back to my attacker-controlled machine. So kind of similar concept, man in the middle, or machine in the middle, adversary in the middle, what do you want to call it? We're sitting in the middle collecting connections, and within those connections are credentials, or credential data that we can harvest and take offline. These tools right here have been listed, man in the middle 6, Pretender. Again, nothing novel or new. I didn't develop these tools. I'm really just explaining the research that's been already put forth by people much smarter than me. There's extra here just to look into as well. There's something called WPAD, DNS hijacks, ARP spoofing. I'm not going to get too much into that, just because I think the two that I've already mentioned are probably more important just to prioritize and fix. This is what IPv6 looks like, by the way. So again, this is Kali Linux. I'm running the tool man-in-the-middle 6 up top here, and I have this IPv4 address of my machine. And I'm starting to hand out addresses to every machine on the network. So I'm just handing out these addresses of saying, hey, here's your new IPv6 address, here's your new one. And the machine will happily accept it. Now the fix is not to disable IPv6, but just simply disable the ability for DHCPv6 to be assigned to the endpoints. That's a simple fix. Okay, so what if your password policy is great? Maybe you've gone through the endeavor of enforcing a 14 minimum length password character, you have a ban list, you make sure that your users will never have a password that is either easily guessed, or I will never be able to use a password cracking station offline and crack it. I'll never be able to crack it. If that's true, There's another attack vector. This may be a little bit too difficult to read, but I'll go into each one, the main ones I want to talk about, which is SMB and LDAP. But instead of capturing that hash, I can simply replay it off. So the connections are coming into me or connecting to my attacker host, we can call it. I can start replaying them off to different services of my choosing. Again, now we're talking about another default. So by default, the SMB service, the server message box service in Active Directory, this is pretty much what supports the ability to access your file shares and how data is transmitted over the network. If you go to a central file share in your internal network in Active Directory, fs1.wolfandco.com, for example, that could be my file share, and I'm simply going to click on that folder, and I automatically log into it, and I can see all the different files and everything within that directory. That's great. But by default, again, another default is digital signing is not enabled. Many of you maybe have heard of SMBv1, and that's great to disable and turn off to enforce SMBv2 or SMBv3, the latest and greatest protocols for that. But by default, digital signing is not enabled. What you can think of it as is essentially me placing a stamp on a message and ensuring that integrity can come back to me. I'm essentially acting as a notary. If I'm signing it, I'm saying that this actually came back and is actually from me, and you can actually validate it. So every time I go to fso1.wolfandco.com, the server, fso1.wolfandco.com, can actually validate and say, yep, you're the machine that actually came and made that request initially. Instead of me, the attacker host, now replaying off that session and hijacking and impersonating as that user. That's essentially what the digital signing or enforcement actually means. 10 years ago or so, you probably read blog posts or were really concerned about turning this on because if you add a digital signature, that means more computational power for your host, and that may downgrade performance. At this point, I don't really see all too much of a reason why this can't be enforced. Maybe you have some sort of legacy application. I'd love to know kind of intricate details if you had difficulties, but at least go through the effort to figure out, can we stage this out at a workstation level, server level, whatever you need to do to figure out how to actually enforce this. Because again, if I can't crack a password, this is the next thing I'm doing. I'm enumerating which host, which is very trivial to do. I'm using a tool here that's commonly referred to as crackmap.exec. It's another kind of Swiss Army knife toolkit for a penetration tester. And I'm enumerating and figuring out hosts in the network, getting back details of your Active Directory domain, and also checking if signing is enforced or not. So in my kind of test environment, I'm using the game of Active Directory, just a lab environment, but I can see a lot of information at once of which hosts do not have signing and which ones can I actually target with my replay attack. So in this command right below, I'm using NTM RelayX, which is from the InPacket library, and I'm targeting this host, which was found from this enumeration of saying this does not have signing, so I'm going to target it. Now, combining all the efforts that we've just gone through of talking about insecure name resolution protocols or IPv6, I can now perform this replay attack. I can target, again, this is from the NTM RelayX tool, and I'm targeting this host, and you can see the connection was successful. So in this case, I'm essentially impersonating as Edward Stark, long live the king, but I'm essentially impersonating their user account by hijacking the session. So I didn't actually need to crack the plain text password. I don't have their password, but I can impersonate them. And by default, if they're an admin to this host, so if it's a domain admin or it's a server admin, workstation admin, if they're an admin to the host that I'm targeting, this tool is going to dump the local account credentials stored in that system. I'll get into what that actually means in a second, but it's really important to differentiate that, especially if there's students in the room. I commonly see a huge struggle point to understand what a local account is compared to a domain account. But here, we're essentially dumping the local account credentials. You may be wondering, what am I showing you here? Because this is a bunch of jungled mess that I don't understand. Well, in Active Directory, and this has been a well-researched, Microsoft has created a white paper about it 15 or so years ago. But this part of the hash, the right side column where it ends with the second column, or the second semicolon right here, this hash can actually be used as the password in Active Directory. It's a little bit more complicated than that. You can't just simply take that and log into your workstation in the morning and type that in. But you can perform network-based logons with an Active Directory using this hash. So every account here should be assumed now compromised. If Edward Stark was an admin to this host, I performed that poisoning attack, I performed the IPv6 attack, I replayed it off because it didn't have that digital signature or a stamp notifying from the client session. I'm now Edward Stark, I could dump credentials just by default. Now you have made some security solutions in the background that may be able to detect this, but it probably is better at least to prevent it. And by default, a lot of your EDRs are not detecting this because you need to configure and tune it. So what can you actually do with that credential? That's where many of you have probably heard about this, the local administrator password solution. I'm going to have a little bit more of a nuanced take here because I commonly see this either missing or inaccurately configured. Last week I was doing a penetration test, and the client, this is a repeat client, they implemented the lapse. They were really happy and they were really excited to prevent this lateral movement where maybe they weren't able to successfully implement signing, but they figured that, okay, you can become the local administrator to this computer, but we're going to prevent you from actually laterally moving because what the local account is solving and what it's trying to solve is when an admin deploys a workstation in Active Directory, you have something called the SID 500, the default local administrator account. So workstation A gets deployed. They need to choose a password. Workstation B gets deployed. They need to choose another password. C, so on. And within that password, they need to essentially create something that is probably not unique. It's kind of a shared credential. And if I compromise that one host, I can then laterally pivot and use this credential as administrator and compromise all those other workstations that have the same password configured. So that's where Lapse was introduced by Microsoft. It's one of the free, very powerful tool. It's amazing that it's free for Microsoft, and probably the biggest security kind of from a proactive and actual step, kind of the biggest value that you can gain in your environment today. If you have not implemented Lapse, I highly recommend to do so for workstations and servers. You can't do it for DCs. There's no local account for DCs. Don't try. But for member servers and your workstations, please do this as soon as possible. And make sure it's configured correctly. So like I was mentioning, I was doing this Active Directory assessment. We found the local admin hash, but I noticed the account was disabled. They disabled it, but enabled Lapse. So Lapse only manages one account. It manages a SID 500 account. You can specify another one by choosing the name in the group policy setting. But if you don't do that, what this client did was just made 2 other local accounts that were local admin on the workstations, and I just took that hash and continued to pivot on. So it was almost a wasted effort, and I continuously see the problem where many people think they can just implement Lapse and just forget about it. You need to audit your workstation servers and figure out what local accounts are actually tied to that machine. Audit your environment, see what local accounts actually exist. Is it still the Lapse account, and is that the only one that's there? And if it's not, ask questions to your sysadmins, figure out why they have this backdoor account, or why are they not using the technology or this control, how it was built and designed to be so. At this point, many people are now managing the workstation and servers with a domain account. That domain account is what you get when you start in Active Directory and how you should be logging in. It's pretty rare that you should be using the local account really for anything other than emergencies or kind of software upgrades or whatever the case could be. So let's talk about LDAP Relay. The same thing, LDAP is the service within Active Directory to help handle authentication and makes modifications to the domain. Similar attack, but instead of targeting SMB, we can target the LDAP service. And now we can make modifications to the domain. So I mentioned within the SMB relay, by default, I'm going to try and dump credentials that are locally tied to the system. There's more interesting things that we could do, but that's the #1 default approach and what penetration testers will do. But the LDAP relay, if, for example, you've implemented SMB signing, this one's usually missed as well. We come to a client, they've enforced signing everywhere. Great, we can't do the SMB relay attack. We can't crack any passwords because maybe we still see the insecure name resolution protocols or IPv6. We get stuck, and this is the next thing we're going to try. An LDAP relay attack is all we're doing is targeting a domain controller in this perspective, running the same tools in the background of poisoning requests. In this case, Jorah Mormont was nice enough to successfully authenticate. I'm now Jorah. And I can modify the domain to create a machine account. This is what the command looks like. So by default, within Active Directory, you can create up to 10 machine accounts. That may be a little bit confusing, but let me say that again. By default, the members of the built-in authenticated user group, which is everyone that has an account in your domain, can add up to 10 workstations. That may sound confusing because you think of a workstation as a physical object, but remember, Active Directory is a directory structure to hold information and data. So that machine account is just simply an object, no different than a user account like myself, a Martirosyan at wolfandco.com. It's really no different. And if that means that any user can create up to 10 machines, that means I can use their privileges even if they're not an admin, just a standard user, someone in HR and accounting. I can use their privileges to create a machine account and essentially get access for myself. I don't need to know what the password is because I'm going to join myself to the domain, And you can see that's what the Jora user account actually did for me. They created this machine account, and here's a password. We can also manipulate the domain. So if we hijacked an admin session, then we can replay it off and make additional modifications to Active Directory that are much more severe of, for example, adding ourselves to the enterprise admins group, or we can do a lot of Kerberos authentication abuse. A little bit out of scope for this session. It'll take too long to kind of go into it. But just know, to prevent all that, implement LDAP signing. This is what it looks like for the group policy for the default. By default, if you have not changed this policy, add workstation in the domain, authenticated users can add up to 10. And you should specify that just to be your admins, or really a group you could specify as, well, my IT team or this help desk team is the ones that can only add workstations to the network. Let's go into more new attacks. So SCCM is, if you have it in your network, it really helps manage configurations, push patches. It does a whole lot of different things. But just know that there's a recent attack that you can perform against SCCM. There's more novel and nuanced attacks that you can use with the command and control server. But this attack also exists where you could perform a similar attack where you can leverage that, add workstation in the domain. You can add a workstation to the domain and target any SCCM server that you can find. So in this case, I'm using a tool called SCCM Hunter. There's a GitHub public tool for this to run this. And I'm simply authenticating and trying to find and enumerate as many SCCM services as I can. I'm using the machine account that I have access to, or I can create a new one. And from there, I get network access accounts or the secrets that have been published. So if you use network access accounts, if you're pushing out updates or managing configurations, those network access accounts are stored within this policy, and computer accounts can request them. If that means that I don't have access to a computer account, I can create one and simply request that policy. And within that policy is credentials that can be taken offline and decrypted, because Microsoft has kind of screwed up the cryptography there. We can take those credentials, and now we have the network access accounts. Another attack just to be aware about. I listed the, again, this, we have so much limited time, but you can simply look up this talk from BHIS, Black Hills. They go into a lot more detail of kind of more novel attacks, especially if you have SCCM in your own environment. ADCS, Active Directory Certificate Services. This has been like the hottest issue for the past like 2 years essentially of what penetrations are going through, and continuously what we see problems. The endpoint looks like this. So certificate services, if you have an environment where you're pushing out, maybe it's for mobile devices or you need devices to authenticate with certificates, you may have an Active Directory certificate service. To perform this attack against that web enrollment service, so by default, if you have that web enrollment service, this is what it looks like. We can coerce credentials from the Active Directory domain. So this requires a user account and password. So either we made one or we've asked for one. And if we are successful in compromising an account, we can simply coerce credentials, meaning we can coerce that NTLM-v2 session. If you saw that orange text from the responder tool, we can do the same with coercer. We can simply coerce a machine account to connect back to our server. There's a lot of different RPC functions and services that we can kind of target. You can see in the bottom, this one was successful. I kind of highlighted it here. But you can see this one succeeded in the connection, and I can force a computer to essentially authenticate back to me. What that looks like is I set up the command here. This is using the coercer tool that was just before. I set up my new NTLM relay, the same tool that we used for the SMB relay attack, the LDAP relay attack. I'm targeting the ADCS endpoint, this where the web enrollment service is, and I get a connection back from a DC. So instead of targeting user accounts, I'm now targeting tier 0 objects, or these privileged assets, and I'm pulling their credential and relaying it off. From there, I get the certificate that I requested, which was the template of a domain controller, and I can essentially become a domain controller. To fix that attack, either disable the web enrollment service, or you may need to disable NTLM on the web enrollment service itself, so that attack gets negated entirely. You need to treat the ADCS server as a tier 0 object. We'll get into what that actually means, hopefully, if I don't run out of time. So this is what it looks like from an attacker perspective to find. It's trivial to find. It's not anything secretive. We can simply enumerate it and find the web enrollments enabled. And from there, we can take that certificate, and we recover this funny-looking mess right here, if you remember, is the hash that we can use to authenticate to the domain. So we essentially become a domain controller. The domain controller is a privileged tier 0 object. That's kind of the server that stores all your credentials and user accounts. And since it's a privileged object, it can perform what's known as a DC sync attack. It's to pull all the credentials, and you can essentially impersonate now any account that you want. So we clearly just demonstrated from going from nothing of just a user account just to a tier 0 and dominating the entire domain. That essentially means I have access to all your systems and all your data. ESC1 is also the most common one that we commonly see. ESC1 allows you to impersonate really any user. The key indicators here is enrollee supply subject on the template. So instead of targeting the ADCS server itself, the Active Directory Certificate Service, we're targeting a template. The template has enrollee supply subject and client authentication. Don't worry about too much of the details, but you can audit this yourself really quickly, either using the tools in the session or public ones. There's PSKI audit, the PowerShell commandlet. You can either review the templates yourselves. But if you see this, just know that it's probably vulnerable. And you should be able to use these offensive tools to your own end to understand of what's actually happening before a penetration tester like myself. This attack essentially does the same thing for web enrollment, but we specify a user that we want to impersonate as. Instead of becoming a domain controller, we can become a domain admin simply by requesting it with our user account that we compromised. Bloodhound, we're running out of time, so I'm going to go as quickly as I can. Bloodhound is a graphical database. CISA, Microsoft, PwC recommends to run this in your own environments. Don't just treat this as an offensive security tool. This is the main point that I was mentioning, that attackers think in graphs. So you can run this tool. There's a various set of collectors, they call it. The one that I used in the previous slide is a Python-based one to be able to pull any information. The key point here is that any user is able to enumerate the domain and recover directory information. So again, Active Directory information, that's how you should treat it. All this information can be enumerated by any of your users. There's not any privileges or special privileges that I've assigned. We simply ran this and we could see the graphical, like Google Maps version of a penetration test. We could see that where the members are, the domains. I didn't really highlight too much here just because it would be a little bit too complicated, but just think about Bloodhound as the Google Maps to trying to figure out what is the fastest way for me to compromise the domain or become a domain admin. Let's go into some Microsoft 365 attacks while we still have some time. If you take anything else away from your talk, if you have Microsoft 365, please test this as soon as possible. You have a smart host, and this is not enabled or disabled. It's not anything you control over. If you have a Microsoft 365 license, you simply have this endpoint. It's called a smart host. It was designed for IoT devices, ability to print and do other jobs. You can test that with a commandlet here. It's a PowerShell commandlet to send mail. But from the public internet, I guarantee at least 50% or if not more of you are probably vulnerable to this. You can impersonate any from address, so I can impersonate Microsoft, I can impersonate your own internal domain, and send users emails to anyone that has a valid inbox within Microsoft 365, bypassing your primary mail gateway and sending messages in. I don't know why Microsoft still has not really commented too much about this. We use this on all our external testing. Please fix this as soon as possible. We have a blog post, and Black Hills has a really good blog post to go into it, but this is how you fix it. You go to, with a connector rule, review the blog post as well, but you can essentially create a connector rule to fix that entirely and prevent people from just sending your users and spoofing any user account that they want. Microsoft Teams, by default, allows anyone to send external messages. You may not think that's a big issue just because you may have seen this. It's a warning banner that's appended to every message. So everyone will see this warning banner if you send an external message. What I mean by that is if Wolf & Co., for example, myself, if I message one of your employees and you have the default for Microsoft Teams, I can send them a message directly, any of your employees. They'll see this message warning and say that you need to authorize or approve the request, but there's a really trivial bypass. Before it was to essentially add that external user twice to a group. That's now changed to essentially inviting them to a meeting, and you can bypass this message warning and send them a direct message. If that doesn't sound really scary, it hopefully should. I can send your users anything they want, and I can impersonate that display name to say whatever I want. So if I want to say, I'm the Wolf Help Desk, I'm targeting my own employees, I could do that and send them direct messages with whatever content I want, a link, a phishing link, a credential harvesting link, etc. Device code phishing, this is probably the last thing that I can really talk about before I run out of time. This is an example of what we can do and what we've done with Microsoft Teams, is sending, instead of a link that's going to get burnt immediately with smart, anything that you may have a control like a web filter or anything, we're going to send this to this page that has only Microsoft-related content. This link right here, you can think of it as the Netflix or Hulu authentication for Microsoft, right? So there's a device code if you've set up for your families as TV single sign-on perspective. For your, you can generate a device code essentially that the attacker controls. If the user signs into this endpoint, which is a legitimate Microsoft endpoint, they are presented a login page like this. They'll enter the code, and in turn, we effectively bypass multi-factor authentication and compromise their account entirely. We're approaching time, so I don't want to talk too much about this, but I do want to talk about this as one single takeaway from Active Directory. If that was too much content, we could talk about it afterwards. But the tiered administrative strategy, before in Microsoft, the legacy way of doing things has always been to, it's called the Red Forest design, to segregate your admins. The Red Forest design is no longer a concept within Active Directory. Microsoft no longer recommends it. They use something called RAMP. I won't get too much into the details. But one of the things of, when people heard Microsoft no longer supports RAMP, they just simply stopped adopting this idea because they thought it didn't work. But this is probably the biggest takeaway and probably what I've seen least implemented of most of your admins probably have only 2 accounts, a domain admin and an IT admin for their endpoint or anything like that. I highly encourage you to go through the exercise of trying to tier out your assets and tiering out where your admins actually exist. To the point that a workstation, for example, if you're an admin to a workstation, you just have your workstation admin account. If you need a server, you have a server admin account that's separate and cannot access the workstation tier. That way you're tiering out your assets and ensuring that if I compromise a credential, I cannot simply pivot to or laterally pivot to the next tiers. I know we're at time, so I'm going to try and hold this for any questions. I had one last bonus TTP there, but we kind of ran out of time. Any questions, comments? Go back to the last slide. I have one last bonus slide, then, if there's no questions. Does everyone know what the bonus TTP is? I didn't talk about passwords. Please fix this. If you have Microsoft 365 or a P2 license, implement Azure AD password protection or a similar control. You're probably paying for it. It can be implemented on-prem. AD needs a 14 minimum length or greater password policy. If you have 8 or anything less, we're probably going to crack it or we're probably going to be able to guess it. Conditional access policies are broken usually within Microsoft 365. That's how we get in with Microsoft Teams and bypassing all the fun stuff that we do. Use a gap analyzer or use a secure score to audit your own environments within the cloud. I know we're over. There's a happy hour, so I don't want to hold you unless people want to hear more about Active Directory. I can keep going, but any questions? Yeah, device code. Does that only work if you're using Microsoft MFA, or would it work? It works for everything. Okay, so it doesn't matter. So the question was, does this attack for the Microsoft device code, does it work for any other authenticators out of just Microsoft? The answer is yes. What the user will see is they'll enter the code. They'll see that they're signing into Microsoft Office. If there's MFA prompted, they will use MFA for Duo or whatever the Okta, whatever the case is. They'll authenticate, and the message will say, you've been signed into Office. You can now close this browser. That's all they see. They don't see any indicator warning, and we have their access tokens. So we don't have their plain text password, but we have tokens that we can use to use the API and do a lot of fun stuff in the background. Yes? Question? Yep. Yeah, but the problem is that this doesn't matter because if I generate a code, so the attack looks like this. I'm the one generating this code, and this is a device code. This is not a MFA code. I can generate the device code and give it to a user within a Microsoft Teams message, or I can send them a link to see what this message actually looks like. But it's kind of like Hulu or Netflix, so you can sign into your TV without actually signing in through the TV. You sign in through a browser. That's kind of what's going on. So I target users or tell users to log in here, which is Microsoft's version of that Hulu sign-in. They use a code that I generated, and they authenticate. That's all that happens. And in turn, since they authenticate with my code, it doesn't matter if they use MFA or whatever the case is. I use their access tokens. I bypass MFA. That's a good question, though. Anything else? I know we're at time. Happy hour is still going on. You don't have to stay just for active. Question? Good question. So tier 0 should be thought of domain controllers, SCCM, ADCS. Those objects that are so critical that if I compromise, it's game over. Tier 0 means that it's game over if I compromise. I'm the highest level of privilege. I own everything in the Active Directory domain. At that point, you can just treat me as a domain admin. Tier 1 is a member server. So those are your server tiers. Those are also critical. You want to protect your application servers, database servers, anything that controls data. Store that in your member servers. That's tier 1. Obviously, a standard user in accounting shouldn't be an admin to a member server. I've seen it. We've seen a lot of different things. But that's how you classify tier 1. And in tier 2 is your workstation level. That's your user active subnet. Good question. Yes, good point. Kerberos, I didn't even talk about that. But yes, it's all too common. The question or the comment was, do not use privilege accounts for SPNs, which is the server's principal name. It's for the protocol that I didn't even talk about. There's so much that we could talk about within Active Directory. So I know I'm already well over, but I appreciate people's questions. Good. Any other comments? Cool.